She was never meant to be more than a placeholder, and now that I've found something real, I need you gone quietly." That was the sentence, spoken in the warm amber light of the study Elira had spent 4 years believing was hers, that made the mate bond in her chest tear like wet paper. She didn't scream. She didn't fall. She stood in the shadow of the doorway, with her hand pressed flat against the cold oak frame, and felt the golden thread that had bound her soul to Cathan Vardain, Alpha King of the Silverthorn territories, snap strand by strand until there was nothing left but a raw and bleeding absence where her whole life had been. Blood roared in her ears. Her knees wanted to buckle, and through the gap in the door she saw the woman he had chosen to replace her, and the sight of that face was worse than the words, because Elira knew that face better than she knew her own reflection. It was Sana. It was her dead sister's best friend. Elira's twin, Isolde, had died in a border skirmish 3 winters ago, torn apart by rogues, while the pack she had served since childhood arrived too late to save her, and Sana had wept the loudest at the funeral. Sana had held Elira's hands and promised, through her tears, that they were sisters now, bound by the woman they had both loved and lost. Sana had moved into the guest wing at Elira's own invitation, comforted by her, fed at her table, dressed in gowns Elira had chosen for her, out of pity for a girl with no family left. And now Sana sat curled against the arm of the Alpha King's chair, with her fingers threaded lazily through his hair, and she was laughing, and Cathan's hand rested on the small curve of her belly, as though it held the future of the entire kingdom. Because it did. Elira understood in that instant, with the terrible clarity of a woman who has just been struck sober, exactly what she was looking at. Sana was carrying the pack's heir. The child Elira had prayed for through 3 barren years, blaming her own body, weeping into her pillow while Cathan slept, turned away from her. That child had been fathered in the same walls that housed her marriage, and everyone had known but her. "When will you tell her?" Sana asked, and her voice was silk over a blade. "She still thinks you love her, Cathan. It's almost sad. She's useful," he said. "The Vardain treasury runs on her family's minds. I'll unwind it slowly. She's clever, but she's soft. She won't fight. She never fights." He tilted his head back against Sana's hand, like a great cat accepting a scratch. "By spring she'll be forgotten and you'll wear the crown." Elira stepped back from the door. The corridor stretched dark and cold before her, the tapestries her mother had woven, hanging still and silent, the stone floor worn smooth by 4 years of her own footsteps, carrying tea and ledgers and love to a man who had catalogued her as a resource. She did not weep. Something in her had gone very quiet, the way the forest goes quiet before the snow, and in that quiet a single thought surfaced and held. "He thinks I never fight because I never had to. He has never once seen what I am when I decide to." She turned and walked back down the corridor the way she had come, and her footsteps made no sound at all. Elira Corman had not always been the soft-spoken queen consort who ran her fingers over supply ledgers and smoothed disputes between minor lords with a gentle word. Before Cathan, before the crown, before the day her father sold her hand to secure a marriage alliance between 2 struggling territories, she had been the daughter who ran the accounts of the Corman mines, while her twin trained with the border wolves. Isolde had been the fighter. Elira had been the mind. And when Isolde died, and Elira married the Alpha King, who had promised to protect them both, she had folded her sharpness away and let it gather dust. Because a good wife did not correct her husband, did not out-negotiate his lords, did not remind a proud man that half his wealth flowed from her family's hills. She had made herself small to fit the shape of the love she thought she had. Now she climbed the north stair to her private rooms, with her spine straight and her mind moving faster than it had in years. She locked the door behind her. She sat at the writing desk beneath the window, where the moon poured silver across the parchment, and she did not light a lamp, because she did not want the guards in the courtyard to see her awake. In the dark, she opened the false bottom of her jewelry chest, the one the carpenter old Bren had built for her in secret the winter after Isolde died, and she lifted out the things she had been hiding for 2 years without ever quite admitting to herself why she was hiding them. There was a leather folio of documents, deeds, contracts, the original charters of the Cormin mining rights, all of them bearing her name and not her husband's, because in the frenzy of the wedding no one had bothered to transfer them, and Elira, being clever and being soft, had never mentioned it. There was a ring of iron keys to the counting house in the merchant city of Dunmarrow, 3 days' ride to the east, a property she had purchased quietly through an intermediary and never told a living soul about. There was a heavy purse of gold coin, saved a little at a time from the household allowance Cathan thought she spent on gowns, and there was a folded letter, sealed with green wax, from a woman named Maricel Thorne, the sharpest trade broker in the Eastern Kingdoms, who had written 3 months ago to say that if Elira Cormin ever tired of playing queen, there was a chair waiting for her at the table where real power was bought and sold. Elira had not answered that letter. She looked at it now, and understood that some part of her had been preparing for this night for a very long time. She pressed her hand once more to her chest, where the bond had been. The ache there was not gone. It would not be gone for a long time, perhaps not ever. But underneath the ache, cold and clean, was something she recognized, and it took her a moment to name it, because it had been so long. It was purpose. By dawn she had made 3 decisions. She would take nothing that Cathan had given her, not the jeweled combs, not the wedding rings, not the crown of silverthorn that sat under glass in the treasury. She would take only what was hers, what she had built and bought and earned, and she would leave without a word, because words were his weapon and silence was hers, and she would rather he lay awake wondering than have him watch her weep. She began very quietly to pack. The morning came grey and reluctant, mist clinging to the mountains that ringed the Silverthorn hold like the walls of a cup. Elira dressed in the plainest clothes she owned, a travelling gown of undyed wool, boots meant for the road, a cloak with a deep hood. She did not ring for her maid. She did the work herself, and it steadied her, the way physical tasks always had. She packed the folio and the keys, and the gold and the letter, into a single satchel that would not draw attention. She left the jewelry chest open on the vanity, with every gem Cathan had ever given her arranged neatly inside, and on top of them she laid the 2 wedding rings, the plain silver band of the betrothal, and the heavy ring of office that marked her as consort. She set them side by side on the black velvet, and for a long moment she looked at them, and then she looked away. There was a knock at the servant's door. Soft, 3 raps and a pause and one more, the pattern she and old Bren had agreed upon years ago, without ever saying aloud what it was for. She opened it. The old carpenter stood there in his work apron, cap in his gnarled hands, and his weathered face was folded into an expression she had not seen on him before. It took her a moment to realize it was grief. He knew. Of course he knew. The servants always knew before the masters admitted anything to themselves. "The cart's in the lower yard, my lady," he said quietly. "Loaded with timber for the Dunmarrow joiners. There's a space beneath the boards, wide enough. No one checks the outbound lumber. They only check what comes in. He hesitated. I built it wide 2 years ago. I hoped I was building it for nothing. Elira felt her throat tighten and forced it smooth. You could lose your position for this, Bren. You could lose worse. I lost the thing that mattered when they let your sister die, and called it fate, he said. And I'll not stand in this hall another day, watching them do to you what they did to her. Isolde saved my grandson from the river when he was 6, pulled him out with her own hands, and never asked for a thing. There's a debt in this house that's never been paid, and I mean to pay a piece of it now. She did not embrace him. He would not have wanted it, and there was no time. But she took his rough hand in both of hers and held it, and she said, "When you tell your grandson the story of how you served the Cormans, tell him you were the only man in this hold with a spine." "Go on," he said gruffly, and turned his face away, "before the sun burns off the mist and someone with eyes wakes up." She went. Down the servants' stair, through the cold kitchens where the fires had not yet been lit, out into the lower yard where the mist lay thick as wool, and the lumber cart waited with its patient ox and its false-bottomed bed. She climbed in among the raw pine boards, into the space old Bren had built for a day he prayed would never come, and she lay down in the dark with her satchel clutched to her chest as he laid the last planks over her and drove the wedge home. Through the gaps, she could see slivers of grey sky. She heard the gate ward call out a bored greeting. She heard Bren answer, easy as breathing, and the great iron gates of the Silverthorn hold groaned open, and the cart lurched forward over the cobbles. She held her breath as the wheels found the mountain road. She did not let it out until the sounds of the hold had faded entirely behind them, and there was nothing left but the creak of the axle and the plod of the ox, and the vast, indifferent silence of the peaks. Only then, in the dark and the pine scent and the jolting of the road, did Elira Corman allow herself to grieve, silently, thoroughly, for the woman she had been, and the love she had believed in, and the future she had prayed for, that had belonged to someone else all along. And when the grief had run its course, somewhere in the long grey miles between the mountains and the plains, it left behind that same cold, clean thing she had found in the dark of her rooms. She dried her face on her sleeve. She began, in her mind, to build. 6 months later, in the merchant city of Dunmarrow, a woman known as Elira Thornmere sat at the head of a long table in a counting-house that smelled of ink and beeswax and money, and she watched 3 grown men argue about copper as though their lives depended on it, because they very nearly did. She had taken her mother's maiden name, Thornmere, and shed the Corman with the deliberateness of a snake shedding skin. In Dunmarrow, no one knew her as a discarded queen. They knew her as the sharp-eyed newcomer who had arrived in the spring with a folio of authenticated mining charters and a purse of gold, and an instinct for the movement of goods that bordered on the uncanny. Within a month, she had bought a controlling interest in a failing copper concern. Within 3, she had turned it profitable by rerouting the ore through a river passage the previous owners had been too proud to negotiate for. Within 5, she had become a name that other names spoke carefully. And Maricel Thorne, the trade broker whose letter had waited 2 years for an answer, had become both her partner and, slowly, cautiously, her friend. The change in her was not only in her circumstances, it was in her body. She stood straighter. She met eyes and held them. She had learned to let silence do her work in a negotiation, to let the other party fill the quiet with concessions, and she had discovered that the very softness Cathan had catalogued as weakness was, when sharpened, the deadliest tool in the room. Men underestimated a woman who listened. They talked, and they revealed, and she remembered everything. And then she moved. "The copper stays in Dunmarrow warehouses until the spring thaw," she said now, and the three arguing men fell silent, as though she had rung a bell. "The mountain roads are impassable in a month. Whoever holds the last dry copper when the passes close sets the price for the entire eastern market until they open again. You want to sell now because you are afraid. Fear is expensive. I am not selling." She looked at each of them in turn, unhurried. "You may sell your share to me at today's price, or you may hold with me until spring and share the profit. Those are the options. There is no third." They sold to her, all three, because fear is expensive, and they were afraid, and Elira Thornmere added another link to a chain of quiet ownership that was beginning to wrap itself around the copper trade of two kingdoms. When they had gone, Maricel Thorne came in from the adjoining room where she had been listening, as she always listened, and set 2 cups of hot spiced wine on the table, and sat down across from Elira with the frank, appraising look that had unnerved Elira the first dozen times, and now felt like coming home. "You've stopped flinching," Maricel said. "When?" "Just now. When Halloran raised his voice, you didn't flinch. 2 months ago you would have." Maricel sipped her wine. "Whatever they did to you in those mountains, you're winning the war against it." Elira wrapped her hands around the warm cup and said nothing for a moment. She had never told Maricel the full story. She had said only that she had left a marriage that had catalogued her as a possession, and Maricel, who had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered a dozen men who thought her grief made her soft, had not asked for details. But over the months, the story had come out in pieces, in the small hours after long negotiations, in the quiet of the counting house when the clerks had gone home, and Maricel knew most of it now. She knew about Cathan. She knew about Sanna. She knew about Isolde. She did not know one thing, because Elira had only learned it herself a week ago from a merchant fresh off the mountain road who did not know he was speaking to the woman at the center of his gossip. "There's news from Silverthorn," Elira said. Maricela's eyes sharpened. "Tell me." "The mines are failing." Elira turned the cup slowly in her hands. "Not the ore. The ore is as rich as it ever was. The management. When I left everything that was mine, which meant I left the charters that gave the Corman family the right to negotiate the ore contracts. Cathan never transferred them into the Crown's name because I never told him he needed to. He assumed the mines were his because the mine wife was his." She permitted herself the smallest, coldest smile. "The contracts I negotiated all expired at midsummer. There was no one who knew how to renew them. The buyers went elsewhere. The ore sits in the mountain, and the treasury that runs on it is bleeding out a little more every month, and Cathan Vardane, Alpha King of the Silverthorn, cannot for the life of him understand why." Maricel set down her cup very carefully. "And the copper you've just cornered feeds the same eastern market that Silverthorn silver used to feed. By spring, when the passes close, I will own the last dry metal between here and the coast, and the buyers who used to come to Cathan's door will come to mine." Elira looked up. "I did not plan this to hurt him. I want you to understand that. I planned it to survive. But the 2 things turned out to be the same thing, and I have stopped pretending that troubles me." Maricela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have him ruined by midwinter. You have the leverage. Squeeze the market. Refuse Silverthorn a single contract, and the treasury collapses. His lords turn on him. It would be justice. It would be cheap, Elira said. And it would be loud, and it would tell him that he still matters enough to me that I would spend my strength breaking him. She shook her head slowly. No, I am not going to break him, Maricel. I am going to build something so much larger than him that his fall will simply be a thing that happens near me, unremarked, the way a candle gutters in the same room where the sun comes up. She finished her wine and rose. Let him come to me. He will. When the treasury is empty and the lords are hungry, someone in that hold will remember that the Eastern metal now flows through a house in Dunmarrow, and they will send an envoy to beg for terms, and they will not know whose door they are knocking on until it opens. Outside, the bells of Dunmarrow rang the evening hour, and the last light of the setting sun caught the copper roofs of the counting houses and set the whole city gleaming like a coin held up to the fire. Elira Thornmere stood at the window and watched it, and she thought about the woman who had lain in the dark of a lumber cart 6 months ago, and grieved. That woman had believed her life was over. She had not understood that it was only just beginning, and that everything she had thought was weakness had only ever been strength she had not yet been permitted to use. In the mountains, in the great hall of the Silverthorn hold, the Alpha King Caithan Varden sat upon a throne of black wood and silver thorn, and was, for the first time in his life, afraid. He did not show it. A king does not show fear, and Caithan had ruled long enough to keep his face a mask of stone while his mind churned. But the mask was harder to hold than it had once been, because the hall before him was thinner than it used to be. The lords who once packed the benches at every audience came now in smaller numbers and with harder faces. The treasury steward brought him ledgers with rows of red ink and would not meet his eyes, and the ore, the endless silver ore that had made the Silverthorn the richest hold in the mountains, sat in its wagons in the lower yard, because there was no longer anyone waiting to buy it. "Explain it to me again," Caithan said, and his voice was quiet, which was worse than if he had shouted, and the steward flinched. "The contracts, my king, the ones that sold the ore to the eastern houses. They expired at midsummer, all of them, and when we sent to renew, the houses had already committed their coin elsewhere. To a new concern out of Dunmarrow. They say this Thornmere house offers terms we cannot match, and delivery guarantees, and quality assurances written in a hand that—" The steward stopped. "That what?" "That the eastern buyers trust more than ours, my king. They say the terms are drafted the way the old Silverthorn contracts used to be drafted, in the years when—" Again the steward stopped, and this time he could not make himself continue, and Caithan understood, and the understanding was a cold blade slid slowly between his ribs. In the years when the Queen had drafted them. He had not spoken her name aloud in 6 months. He had forbidden it in the hall, had let it be known that the former consort had left of her own accord in a fit of feminine temper and was not to be discussed, and the household had swallowed the lie because households swallow the lies their kings require. But he thought of her constantly, and the thoughts had changed shape over the seasons. In the first weeks he had been merely irritated, inconvenienced by the small chaos of running a household that had run itself for 4 years. Then the contracts had lapsed, and the irritation had curdled into something colder. He had gone into her old rooms one night, alone, and found the jewelry chest still sitting open on the vanity where she had left it, every gem inside untouched, the 2 wedding rings laid side by side on the black velvet like a verdict. She had taken nothing he had given her. She had wanted nothing of his. And that, more than the failing treasury, was the thing that would not let him sleep. He had told Sanna the ore troubles were temporary. He had told his lords the same. He had told himself the same, night after night, and each night the lie grew thinner. "My king," a new voice from the doorway. Cathan looked up to see his chief huntsman, Doran Fell, a grizzled wolf who had served the hold for 30 years and had loved Isolde like a daughter, standing at the edge of the hall with his cap in his hands and an expression that Cathan could not read. "There's a matter I would speak of. Privately." Cathan dismissed the steward with a flick of his hand and gestured Doran forward. The old huntsman came, and he looked at his king for a long moment before he spoke, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man laying out something he had turned over many times before, deciding to say it. "The Eastern House," Doran said. "Thornmere. I've made inquiries. I have kin among the road traders, and they carry news the way rivers carry silt." He paused. "The house is run by a woman. Come up from nothing in the spring, they say, though she had gold and papers to start with. Sharp as a skinning knife. Corners markets like a wolf corners a stag. And she took her mother's name when she came to the city." Another pause. Longer. "Her mother's name was Thornmere, my king, but her father's name was Cormin." The hall seemed to tilt. Cathan gripped the arms of the black throne. "You're certain?" "I'm certain of what I've heard. I'd be certain of more if you'd let me ride east." Doran met his eyes, and there was no fear in the old man's face, only a hard, clear judgment that Cathan had never before had to endure from one of his own. "She's not dead in a ditch, my king, which is what half this hold whispered when she vanished. She's alive, and she's building something that has its hand around the throat of your treasury, and she's doing it without ever once sending you a threat or a demand. That's the part that ought to frighten you." Doran turned his cap in his hands. "A woman who wanted revenge would have taunted you by now. A woman who's simply outgrown you doesn't bother." Cathan said nothing for a long moment. The fire in the great hearth cracked and settled. Somewhere above, in the queen's wing that was now Sanna's, a child cried thinly, the pack's heir, 3 months old and squalling, the child that had been meant to secure everything, and had somehow become the smallest piece of a collapse. Cathan could not stop. "Leave me," he said at last. Doran bowed and turned, and at the door he paused and said, without turning back, "She used to sit with me in the mews some evenings. After her sister died, she never wept where the household could see her, but she wept in the mews with the hawks, because a hawk doesn't gossip. I'm the only one in this hold who ever saw her cry, my king. And I'll tell you what she said to me once, the winter after I sold her. She said, 'A person is only ever as loyal as the last time you chose them.' I didn't understand it then. I understand it now." And he was gone, and Cathan Vardane sat alone in the thinning hall with the red-inked ledgers and the crying child, and the cold understanding settling into his bones like the first frost of a winter that would not end. The winter came hard and early to the mountains, and the passes closed a full month before anyone expected them to, and the entire Eastern metal market snapped shut around a single fact that everyone had seen coming and no one had prevented. The only dry copper between Dunmarrow and the coast sat in the warehouses of the Thornmere house, and the woman who owned it could name any price she liked. She did not gouge them. That surprised the market, and the surprise cost her nothing and earned her everything. Elira set a price that was fair, a little above the summer rate, but nowhere near the ransom she could have extracted, and she released the metal in steady, measured lots so that no buyer starved and no buyer gorged, and by the deepest week of winter, the merchants of 2 kingdoms had learned that the Thornmere house was that rarest of things, a power that could be trusted. Trust, Elira had learned long ago in the counting rooms of her father's mines, was worth more than gold, because gold could be spent once, and trust could be spent forever. Maricela found her one grey afternoon in the map room, standing over the great table where the trade routes of the eastern kingdoms were painted in inks of different colours, red for grain and blue for wool, and a rich burning copper orange for metal. Elira had her finger resting on the mountain passes, on the small painted symbol of the Silverthorn hold, and she was very still. A rider came through the north gate an hour ago, Maricela said, half frozen. Came over the pass on foot when his horse foundered, which no sane man does in this weather. He carries the seal of the Silverthorn crown, and he's asking, very humbly, for an audience with the master of the Thornmere house. She folded her arms. He doesn't know the master is a woman. He certainly doesn't know who the woman is. He thinks he's come to beg a merchant for terms. Elira did not look up from the map. What does he want? Copper, to start. The hold is freezing and their forges are cold for want of fuel metal, whatever that means to a smith. But there's more. The way he's talking, the treasury's near dry, and the lords are restless, and the Alpha King needs a loan against the spring ore, or he'll have a rebellion before the thaw. Maricel's mouth curved. He's come to sell you Silverthorn silver, sight unseen, at whatever discount you'll take, for coin now. Your husband is mortgaging his kingdom to you, and he doesn't even know it. Elira lifted her finger from the map at last, and straightened. 6 months ago, the news would have set her heart racing. Now she felt only the cool click of pieces sliding into place, the same feeling she had when a negotiation resolved exactly as she had foreseen. She had told Maricel she would let him come to her, and here, at last, was the coming. "Bring the rider to the great chamber," she said. "Not the counting room, the great chamber. Light the fires. Give him wine and a dry cloak and food, because he came over the pass on foot, and that is a brave thing whatever master he serves. Let him warm and rest an hour. Then bring him in. And you? I'll receive him." Elira turned toward the door that led to her private rooms. Properly. The great chamber of the Thornmere house was not a throne room, because Elira did not want a throne, having learned what thrones cost the people who sat beside them. But it was a room built to impress, high-ceilinged and warm, its walls hung with maps, and its great table stacked with the ledgers of a dozen concerns, and at the head of the table sat a single tall chair, its back to the door, turned toward the wide window that looked out over the copper roofs of Dunmarrow. When the rider was brought in, an hour later, warmed and fed, and wearing a dry cloak lent to him by the household, he saw only the back of that chair and the figure seated in it, and he took a breath and began the speech he had rehearsed on the long, cold road. "Master Thornmere," he said, "I come from His Majesty Cathan Vardane, Alpha King of the Silverthorn, in the spirit of trade and mutual profit. The Crown wishes to enter into an arrangement for the immediate purchase of copper and the forward sale of silver ore against the spring yield. The terms His Majesty offers are generous, and I am empowered to negotiate." "Stop!" The voice from the chair was quiet, and it was a woman's voice, and the rider faltered. "You've come a long way, over hard country to say words your king wrote for you. I won't waste them by pretending I don't know what they mean. Your treasury is empty. Your lords are hungry. Your forges are cold. And your king has decided that the woman who sits in this chair is the last person in 2 kingdoms who can save his winter." A pause. "Tell me, when Cathan Vardane sent you here, did he tell you the name of the house he was sending you to beg from? He said the Thornmere house, master, a new concern. He said the master was a hard trader, but a fair one. A fair one. Something in the voice turned wry and cold and edged. That's kind of him. Tell me one more thing, and then I'll turn around, and we can speak face to face, like the trading partners we're about to become. Did he ever, in the 6 months since his wife left him, ever once say her name? The rider stared at the back of the chair, uncomprehending. His wife, master. The former consort left of her own. I mean, the household does not speak of... He stopped, and Elira heard the moment the ground shifted under him, heard it in the sudden silence, and she let the silence stretch until it had done its work. Then she turned the chair. She had dressed for this, not in the plain wool of a trader, but in a gown, the deep green of forest shadow. Her dark hair bound back from a face that 6 months of clean, hard purpose had sharpened into something the rider clearly recognized, even as his mind refused to believe it. She saw the recognition break over him like cold water. She saw his mouth open and no sound come out. She had been the queen consort of the Silverthorn for 4 years, and this man had stood in her hall, had bowed to her, had carried her ledgers, and now he was looking at her sitting at the head of the house that held his kingdom's throat in its hand, and every rehearsed word had turned to ash in his mouth. "Sit down," Elira said, not unkindly. "Before you fall down. You've had a long journey and a longer shock, and none of this is your doing. You carry his seal, not his sins." The rider sat. "My name," she said, "is Elira. My father's name was Cormin, and my mother's name was Thornmere, and I took the one that was mine and left the other with the man who taught me it was never worth anything to begin with. You may tell him you found me. You may tell him where. I have hidden nothing for 6 months, except from a man too proud to look for me. And now that he has finally looked, I have no wish to keep hiding." She folded her hands on the table. "Now, let us talk about copper and silver, and exactly what it is going to cost the Alpha King of the Silverthorn to survive the winter he made when he decided I was a resource to be unwound slowly." The rider went back over the pass 3 days later, when a break in the weather allowed it, carrying a sealed document that would change everything, and Elira watched him ride out from the same window where she had watched the sunset gild the copper roofs, and she felt the last piece slide into place with a soft and final certainty. She had not sent Cathan a threat. She had sent him a contract, and the contract was worse than any threat could have been, because it was fair, scrupulously and unassailably fair, and it made him a debtor in his own hall, and it bore at the bottom, in a hand he would recognize from 4 years of ledgers and 4 years of love, the signature of the woman he had thrown away. She had priced the copper fairly. She had agreed to buy the spring silver at a fair rate, and she had loaned the crown the coin it needed to survive the winter, at a fair interest, secured against the ore, with a single clause buried in the fine and faultless legal prose that no one in the Silverthorn hold had the skill to fully pass until it was signed and sealed and returned. The clause did not demand the throne. It did not demand revenge. It demanded only that if the crown defaulted on the loan, the mining charters, the original Cormin charters that had never been transferred, and that Cathan had assumed were his, would be recognized in the courts of 2 kingdoms as belonging, wholly and forever, to Elira Thornmere. It was not a trap she had sprung. It was a truth she had simply written down and let him sign, and the beauty of it was that a man who paid his debts had nothing to fear from it at all. She wondered sometimes, in the weeks that followed, whether he understood yet what he had signed. She thought he did not. She thought he had read only the fair price and the needed coin and the salvation of his winter, and had signed in relief, and had not felt the ground shift beneath him. That was the difference between them, and it always had been. He saw the season. She saw the years. The letter came in the last week of winter, when the passes were beginning to soften and the first melt was running down from the peaks. It was carried by a different rider, and it bore the personal seal of the Alpha King, not the seal of the crown, and it was addressed in his own hand, which she had not seen in 6 months, to Elira, and not to Master Thornmere, and she knew before she broke the wax what it would be. It was not a business letter. It was 3 pages, and it was the letter of a man who had spent a winter alone with the wreckage of what he had done. And it was, in its way, everything she had once dreamed of receiving, and had long since stopped wanting. He wrote that he had been a fool. He wrote that Sanna had left, gone in the deep of winter, to a lesser lord in a lower hold, taking the child and the last of his patience with her, and that the child had never truly bound them, because there had never been anything to bind. He wrote that he understood now, too late, what she had been to the hold, and what she had been to him, that he had catalogued a treasure as a convenience, and had not felt its weight until it was gone. He wrote that the hold was cold, and the hall was thin, and that he lay awake nights thinking of the jewelry chest she had left open on the vanity, of the 2 rings on the black velvet, of the terrible dignity of a woman who took nothing that was given, because nothing that was given had ever been given in love. And at the end, on the 3rd page, in a hand that had grown unsteady, he wrote that he did not ask for forgiveness because he had not earned it, but that he would come to Dunmarrow in the spring when the passes opened, and stand before her, and say all of this to her face, and that if there was any road at all back to what they had lost, he would walk it on his knees. Elira read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the great table, among the ledgers, and she looked out the window at the melting snow, and she was surprised to find that she felt no triumph. She had expected triumph. She had lain in the dark of a lumber cart 6 months ago and imagined this exact letter, and she had thought that when it came, it would taste like victory. Instead, it tasted like nothing at all, like water, like the empty space where a tooth had been pulled, and she understood that this was the real vindication, not the letter itself, but her own indifference to it. She had built something in 6 months that was so much larger than Cathan Vardane that his remorse simply could not reach it. He had come knocking, and she had opened the door, and she had found that she no longer lived in the house he was knocking at. Mariselli read the letter, when Elira wordlessly handed it to her, and when she had finished she set it down and looked at her friend for a long moment. "He's coming in the spring," she said. "On his knees, he says. What will you do?" "I'll receive him," Elira said, "as I received his rider, properly, and I'll listen to every word, because he came a long way to say them, and I'm not a woman who takes pleasure in a man's humiliation." She turned from the window. "And then I'll tell him no, not cruelly, not loudly. I'll tell him no the way you'd tell a stranger no, because that's what he is to me now. And the strangest thing, Mariselli, the thing I didn't expect, is that it's true. I don't hate him. I did, for a while, on the road and in the first weeks here. But hate is a bond too, and I cut every bond I had to that man when I laid those rings on the velvet. He's just a man now, a man who made a bad trade and lost, and who has to live in the hall he emptied. That's not my revenge. That's just his life. The spring came, and the passes opened, and the Alpha King, Varden, came down out of the mountains to the merchant city of Dunmarrow, with a small retinue and a heart full of a hope he had no right to, and a speech he had rehearsed 100 times. And he was received in the great chamber of the Thornmere House by a woman he had once thought he owned, seated at the head of a long table with the ledgers of an empire around her, and she let him say every word. He said them well. He had had all winter to find them. He spoke of his blindness and his pride and his catastrophic failure to see what stood beside him. He spoke of Sanna and the child and the emptiness of the thing he had chosen over her. He did not make excuses, which she noted, because 6 months ago he would have. And at the end, he did what he had written he would do. He came around the table, and he lowered himself to one knee on the polished floor of her house, the Alpha King of the Silverthorn, kneeling to a discarded wife. And he asked, with a humility that she believed was genuine, whether there was any road at all back to her. Elira let the silence hold for a long moment. The spring light came golden through the wide window and fell across the floor between them, and she thought about all the versions of this moment she had imagined, and how none of them had felt like this one, quiet and clean and strangely gentle. "Stand up, Cathan," she said. "You don't kneel in this house. No one does. That's the difference between my house and yours." He stood. "I read your letter 12 times," she said. "I believe every word of it. I believe you're sorry, and I believe you understand now what you threw away. And I want you to hear me say that I don't doubt any of it, because you deserve to be believed even now." She rose from her chair. "But you asked if there's a road back, and I'm going to give you a true answer, because you've earned a true answer if you've earned nothing else. There is no road back. Not because I'm punishing you, because the woman you want back doesn't exist anymore. You didn't just betray me, Cathan. You freed me. You looked at me, and you saw a placeholder, a resource, something soft to be unwound. And the moment I heard you say it, every soft thing in me that had been folded up small to fit your idea of a wife came unfolded all at once, and it turned out to be this." She gestured once at the room, the ledgers, the maps, the empire she had built in the length of a single winter. "You want the woman who ran your household and wept in the mews where no one could see. She's gone. She got into a lumber cart, and she never came back. What's left is the woman who holds the mortgage on your kingdom, and she doesn't want you, and she's not angry at you. And that, I think, is the thing you'll find hardest to bear." Cathan stood very still, and something in his face broke and settled, the last hope going out of it like a fire burning down to ash. "The loan," he said quietly. "The charters. You could have taken everything. The clause. Doran read it to me after I'd signed. You could have defaulted me on a technicality by midwinter and taken the mines and left me with nothing. Why didn't you?" "Because I don't want your mines," Elira said. "I have my own, and because ruining you would have made you the center of my story, and you stopped being the center of my story the day you told Sanna I never fight." She walked to the window and looked out at the city that was hers now, in every way that mattered. "Pay your debt, Cathan. Pay it on the honest terms you signed. Sell me your silver at the fair price, and I'll buy every ounce, because it's good silver, and this is good business, and years from now our houses will trade with each other and profit, and that will be the whole of it. You'll rule your hold, and I'll build my empire, and we'll be 2 powers who do business, and nothing more, and someday you'll understand that this is a kinder ending than either of us deserved." She turned back to him. "The child. Sanna's child. What became of it?" "She took him," Cathan said, "to the lower hold. I send coin for his keeping. He's my heir in name, but she'll raise him among strangers." His voice was hollow. "I have a son I'll see twice a year. That's the future I traded you for." "Then love him," Elira said, and for the first time there was something almost like warmth in her voice, warmth that landed harder for its scarcity, the way you should have loved everything you were given. Ride the 2 days to see him, and don't count them as a burden. Be a better father than you were a husband. That's the only revenge I'd ever ask, and I'm not even asking it. I'm just telling you, because someone in your life ought to, and it clearly isn't going to be anyone in that cold hall of yours." She moved back to the table and picked up a sheaf of documents, the honest contracts, the fair terms. "Sign these. Buy your copper. Sell your silver. Save your winter that's already saved. And then go home, Cathan, and live the life you built, and let me live the one I built out of the wreckage of it. That's all there is now. That's all there ever needed to be." He signed. Of course he signed. There was nothing else for him to do, and the terms were fair, unassailably fair, and that fairness was the sharpest blade she had ever wielded, because it left him no grievance, no injustice to nurse, no story in which he was the wronged party. She had beaten him with generosity. She had beaten him with competence and foresight, and a mortgage he could pay if only he was honest, and she had extended him a mercy so complete that it would haunt him more thoroughly than any cruelty could have, because a man can rage against cruelty forever, but he can only sit alone with mercy and understand, slowly, over years, exactly what he lost and exactly why he lost it, and exactly how little his losing it had cost the woman who used to love him. He rose to leave. At the door he paused, as his rider had paused, as his huntsman had paused, and he said, without turning, "Doran told me something, the night before I rode down here. He said you told him once that a person is only as loyal as the last time you chose them." He was quiet for a moment. "I never chose you. Not once, in 4 years. I assumed you, the way you assume the sun will rise. And then one day it didn't, and I understood what it had been giving me only by the dark it left behind." He turned, finally, and looked at her, and there was no plea left in his face, only a clear and terrible understanding. "You were the best thing I ever had, and I never once chose you. I hope whoever you choose next understands what he's been given." And then he was gone, down the stairs and out into the spring, back toward the mountains and the cold hall and the life he had made, and Elira stood alone in the great chamber with the signed contracts and the golden light and the empire she had built, and she found that her eyes were wet, not for him, and not for the marriage, but for the woman in the lumber cart 6 months ago who had believed her life was over, and who would never know, could never be told, how magnificently, how completely, how quietly she was about to win. Maricel came in after a while and stood beside her at the window, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The bells of Dunmarrow rang the evening hour, the copper roofs caught the last of the light. Down in the streets the merchants were closing their shops, and the lamplighters were beginning their rounds, and the whole city breathed its slow, contented evening breath, the breath of a place that was prosperous and safe, and, increasingly, held together by the invisible hand of a house that had not existed a year ago. "He's paid the copper in full," Maricel said at last. "The first silver shipment comes at the thaw. You've made the Thornmere House the sole buyer of Silverthorn silver for the next 3 years, at a fair price, with the charters as security. In 3 years you'll be the largest metal house in the Eastern Kingdoms, and there won't be a market from here to the coast that moves without your leave." She glanced sideways. "You could have taken his crown, Elira. You settled for owning the ground it stands on. I'll never fully understand you." "You understand me perfectly," Elira said. "You just don't approve of how little I wanted to hurt him." She smiled faintly. "I spent 4 years being told I was soft, Maricele. It turned out soft was just strength that hadn't been given a reason yet. He gave me the reason, and then he was foolish enough to be surprised by what I did with it." She turned from the window. "Isolde would have burned his hall to the ground. My sister was fire. I was always the water, and everyone thought that meant I was weaker, because fire is loud and water is quiet. But water is patient. Water finds every crack. Water wears down stone, and it does it so slowly that the stone never even knows it's losing until it's sand." She picked up the signed contract and held it a moment, this piece of paper that was worth more than an army, and then she set it down among the ledgers of her empire. "He built the walls of his own hall out of the stone I've spent 6 months turning to sand. He just doesn't know it yet. He'll know it in 3 years when the charters come due and he understands that he's been my tenant all along. And even then it won't be revenge. It'll just be the tide." The years that followed proved her right, as the years have a way of doing to the patient. The Thornmere House grew and grew and grew again, until its name was spoken in the same breath as the great trading concerns of the coast, until kings and lords and merchant princes came to its counting-house to beg for terms, and Elira Thornmere received them all the same way, seated at the head of her long table with the ledgers of half a world around her, fair to every one of them, and soft to none. And it became a saying among the traders of the Eastern Kingdoms that the Thornmere House would never cheat you and never spare you, which was the highest praise the trade could give. Maricele grew old at her side, and never once tired of watching men underestimate her friend and pay for it. And in the mountains, in the cold, thin hall of the Silverthorn, Cathan Vardane paid his debts and sold his silver and rode the 2 days to see his son, twice a year at first. And then, as the boy grew and something in the man softened, more often than that, and he ruled his diminished hold with a chastened care that the older wolves said made him a better king than he had been, though a smaller one, and no one ever heard him speak the name Elira again, and no one ever needed to, because it hung over everything he did, like the memory of a summer that would not come back. He never remarried. Doran Fell, before the old huntsman died, said once that the Alpha King had understood, too late, that some things are chosen once and never offered twice, and that a man who fails to choose the sun cannot complain of living in the dark. And when the charters came due, 3 years to the day after Cathan signed them in the golden light of the great chamber, Elira did not seize the mines, though she could have, though the law would have handed them to her without a murmur. She renewed the contracts instead, at a fair price, for 3 years more, and she sent word to the Silverthorn hold that the arrangement would stand as long as the debts were honestly paid, and Cathan understood the message perfectly, because he had finally learned to see the years the way she saw them. She would never take his kingdom. She would simply own the ground beneath it, patiently, quietly, forever, and let him rule his little hall in the shadow of the empire she had built out of the exact softness he had thrown away, and that was the tide, and there was no fighting the tide, and he stopped trying. Elira Thornmere never married again either, though not for grief, and not for lack of offers, for the offers were many. She married nothing but her own work and her own worth, and she found in that a completeness she had never once felt in the gilded cage of the Silverthorn Hold, and if there was warmth in her life, it came from Maricel, who was family in every way that blood had failed to be, and from the young clerks she trained, and from old Bren's grandson, who came to Dunmarrow one spring seeking work and found it, and who she raised through the trade until he ran a counting-house of his own, paying at last the debt his grandfather had spoken of in the grey dawn of an escape long ago. And on the quiet evenings, when the ledgers were closed and the bells had rung, and the copper roofs of her city glowed like a hoard of coins spread out beneath the setting sun, Elira would stand at her window and think, sometimes, of the woman in the lumber cart, and she would raise a cup, silently, to that frightened, grieving girl who had chosen silence over screaming and dignity over rage, and who had lain in the dark, clutching a satchel of hidden assets she had spent 2 years pretending she didn't know she was gathering, and who had built, out of the wreckage of everything, a life so much larger than the one that had been stolen that the theft itself had come to seem, in the end, like the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. Because here is the truth that the Silverthorn Hold learned too late, and that the trading houses of the Eastern Kingdoms learned early, and that every woman folding herself small to fit someone else's idea of her worth should learn before the lumber cart and not after. Worth is not a gift that the powerful bestow. It is not a title granted by a crown or a value assigned by a man who has decided what you are useful for. Worth is proven in the dark, in the silence, in the patient turning of stone to sand, and it is reclaimed on your own terms and no one else's, and the ones who tell you you are soft are only ever telling you that they have not yet seen what you become when you finally decide to stop being what they need. Loyalty cannot be bought, and it cannot be assumed, and it must be chosen again and again by anyone who hopes to keep it. And the strength that matters most in this world is never the strength you are born holding. It is the strength you build, alone, out of the pieces of the life someone else was careless enough to break. Cathan Vardane thought he had discarded a placeholder. He had, instead, awakened a founder, and by the time he understood the difference, she had already built a kingdom he could only ever be a tenant in. If this story moved something in you, if you felt that cold, clean turn of a woman discovering her own worth, do me one small favor before you go. Give this video a like, because it genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who need them. Share it with someone you know who is folding themselves small to fit somebody else's idea of who they should be, because they may need this reminder more than you know. And subscribe, because this is a community that celebrates the quiet, patient, unstoppable rise of the underestimated, and I have so many more of these stories to tell you. And tell me in the comments, was Elira right to spare him, or would you have taken the crown?